She thought breaking into my garage was just another HOA power move, until I calmly closed the door and called the sheriff. It was supposed to be a normal, quiet morning, the kind where nothing dramatic ever happens. But that calm shattered the moment I checked my security monitor and saw her walking up my driveway like she owned the place. This wasn't just any neighbor, this was the HOA Karen. The same woman who lived for rule books, fines, and control. The one who treated her clipboard like a badge and believed her bylaws were stronger than actual law. My garage door was halfway open because I had been organizing tools. And before I could even process what I was seeing, she bent down, slipped under the door, and stepped straight inside my garage without knocking, without calling out, without permission. At first, I honestly thought maybe there was an emergency, but the smug look on her face killed that idea instantly. I walked over and asked as calmly as possible what she thought she was doing on my property, and without missing a beat, she told me she was there to inspect after receiving a complaint. A complaint about what? My own garage. I told her clearly that she was trespassing and needed to leave immediately. But instead of apologizing or stepping back, she smiled and started flipping pages on her clipboard, explaining HOA authority like she was lecturing a child. That's when I realized she genuinely believed she could walk into my private property whenever she wanted. I warned her again, firmer this time, and told her I would involve law enforcement if she didn't leave. She laughed, actually laughed, and said, "Go ahead. You can't lock me in." That was the exact moment I stopped arguing, turned around, and pressed the button that started lowering the garage door. As it slowly came down, her confidence evaporated and turned into panic, shouting that I was violating her rights, that this was illegal, that she would fine me, sue me, and have the HOA president handle me. I calmly pulled out my phone, put it on speaker, and called the sheriff, stating my address and reporting an unauthorized person who had entered my garage and refused to leave. The tone in her voice changed instantly. Suddenly, she wanted to talk. Suddenly, she was polite. Suddenly, she was calling me sir and asking me to open the door. But it was already too late. She had crossed a line she didn't understand, and now every second was being recorded, every word documented. And every threat she made was only making things worse for her. She thought calling the HOA president would save her, but the sound of sirens outside said otherwise. The moment she realized the sheriff was actually on the way, her entire attitude flipped like a switch, and it was almost painful to watch how fast confidence turns into desperation when authority disappears. Just seconds earlier, she had been throwing around threats, fines, and HOA bylaws like weapons. But now she was pacing inside my garage, clutching that clipboard like a life raft, asking me to be reasonable and suggesting we could resolve this internally. I reminded her, calmly and clearly, that she had been told multiple times to leave and chose not to, and that any further discussion could happen with law enforcement present. That's when she pulled out her phone and started dialing someone, loudly announcing she was calling the HOA president, as if that name alone would make me panic and open the door. I could hear her half of the conversation, exaggerating everything, claiming she was being illegally detained, while conveniently leaving out the part where she entered my garage without permission. Meanwhile, the dispatcher stayed on the line with me, instructing me to remain calm and keep the situation exactly as it was. Karen kept glancing at the garage door, then at the walls, then at the camera, slowly realizing that nothing about this situation was going in her favor. When distant sirens became audible, her voice cracked for the first time. She tried one last angle, apologizing, saying it was all a misunderstanding, insisting she only stepped inside for a second, but apologies don't erase trespassing, and misunderstandings don't walk themselves into private property. As the sirens grew louder, she stopped talking entirely, standing frozen in the middle of the garage, finally understanding that this wasn't an HOA matter anymore. It was a legal one, and she had just placed herself squarely on the wrong side of it. The deputy's first question wasn't loud or aggressive, but it instantly destroyed her entire story. When the sheriff's cruiser pulled up outside, the tension inside the garage was so thick it felt like the air itself had frozen, and the moment I heard boots on concrete, I pressed the button to raise the garage door just enough for the deputy to step in. Karen immediately launched into her rehearsed speech, talking fast, pointing at me, claiming she was there on official HOA business and that I had overreacted. The deputy didn't interrupt, didn't argue, didn't even look impressed. He just listened quietly until she ran out of breath. Then he turned to her and asked one simple question. "Did the homeowner invite you into the garage?" The silence that followed was brutal. She tried to dodge it at first, saying HOA inspections were routine and that she had authority under community rules. But the deputy repeated the question, slower this time, making it impossible to escape. Finally, she admitted she hadn't been invited, but insisted she believed she was allowed to enter. That's when the deputy explained in a calm and firm tone that HOA bylaws do not override property law, and entering a locked or semi-private structure without permission is trespassing. Plain and simple. Her face drained of color as he asked for her identification and started taking notes, while I stood there watching her carefully. Constructed sense of power collapse in real time. She attempted to argue again, but this time her words came out weak, almost pleading, because she could tell this wasn't a debate anymore. It was documentation. Every excuse she gave, every justification she tried to offer, was being written down, and she had no control over the narrative now. The clipboard that once made her feel untouchable hung uselessly at her side. And for the first time since I'd known her, the HOA Karen had absolutely nothing to say. She expected a warning, but the deputy's next words hit harder than any fine ever could. The deputy finished writing, looked up at her and explained in a flat, professional tone that this incident was being recorded as an unlawful entry, and that whether charges were filed or not would depend on the homeowner's statement and the district's review. That single sentence completely broke what little composure she had left. She started insisting it was just a misunderstanding, that she had done similar inspections before, and that no one had ever made a big deal out of it. The deputy didn't react to that either. He simply reminded her that other people allowing illegal behavior doesn't make it legal, and that today she had been clearly told to leave and refused. He then turned to me and asked if I wanted to pursue a formal trespassing complaint. I didn't answer right away, not because I was unsure, but because I wanted her to understand something important. This wasn't about revenge, it was about boundaries. I calmly explained exactly what happened, pointed out the security cameras, and mentioned that the entire interaction, from her entering the garage to her refusing to leave, was recorded. As soon as the word recorded came out of my mouth, her shoulders slumped. She knew evidence meant there was no spinning this later at an HOA meeting. The deputy nodded, confirmed he'd review the footage, and warned her directly that returning to my property without written permission would result in immediate arrest. At that point, she was no longer the confident enforcer of community rules. She was just another person being escorted off private property, clutching a clipboard that suddenly felt very small. What happened next didn't just shake her, it sent shockwaves through the entire neighborhood. As the deputy walked her toward the patrol car, neighbors began stepping outside one by one, drawn by the flashing lights and the unmistakable tension in the air. Curtains moved, doors opened, and phones came out because everyone recognized her instantly. The HOA Karen, who loved enforcing rules, but had never once been challenged this publicly. She tried to keep her head high, but it was obvious she felt every pair of eyes on her, every whispered comment cutting deeper than any fine she'd ever issued. The deputy spoke to her quietly, but the seriousness of his tone made it clear this wasn't a casual warning. Meanwhile, I stood by my driveway answering follow-up questions, explaining how she had entered without permission and ignored multiple requests to leave. One neighbor even spoke up, admitting she had done something similar at their house months earlier, though they hadn't known they could push back. That single statement changed the atmosphere. Completely, this wasn't an isolated mistake anymore. It was a pattern. Karen overheard it and snapped around, furious. But the deputy shut it down immediately and told her to remain calm. For the first time, the power dynamic of the neighborhood shifted. People who had been scared of HOA retaliation were now watching an HOA representative face real consequences, and you could feel the unspoken realization spreading. The rules only work if people let them. When the deputy finally told her, she was free to leave, but warned her again about returning. She climbed into her car without another word and drove off in silence, leaving behind a neighborhood that would never see the HOA the same way again. By the next morning, the HOA tried to pretend none of this ever happened, but the paper trail said otherwise. The silence after she drove away didn't last long, because once authority gets publicly challenged, damage control always follows. The very next morning, I woke up to an email from the HOA board, written in that overly polite, carefully worded tone they use when they're scared of liability. They claimed they were unaware of the incident, emphasized that the individual was acting independently, and assured residents that the HOA respects private property rights. It was almost impressive how fast they tried to distance themselves from her actions. What they didn't know was that the deputy had already forwarded the incident report, and my security footage had been formally logged. Neighbors started texting me screenshots of similar emails they'd received, all slightly different, all trying to soften the story before it reached a meeting or a lawyer. At the same time, word spread through the neighborhood like wildfire, people comparing notes, sharing old warnings, and realizing how often boundaries had been crossed without anyone pushing back. A few residents even stopped by to thank me, saying they'd been afraid to challenge HOA inspections for years. The board could deny responsibility all they wanted, but the truth was already out. And once people learn they have rights, it's impossible to make them unlearn that. The HOA's attempt to bury the incident collapsed the moment lawyers got involved. Within days, the tone of every HOA communication shifted from friendly reassurance to stiff, legal language that screamed panic. A certified letter arrived at my door, outlining the HOA's position and politely suggesting we resolve the matter without escalation. I knew exactly what that meant. They were trying to prevent a precedent. I forwarded the letter to an attorney, along with the video footage and the sheriff's report, and his response was immediate and blunt. This wasn't just trespassing. It was liability. He explained that by sending an agent onto private property without permission, the HOA exposed itself to serious legal risk, especially since the incident was documented and witnessed. Meanwhile, neighbors began organizing, sharing their own stories of unannounced inspections and intimidation tactics. And suddenly the HOA board wasn't dealing with one homeowner anymore. It was facing an entire community that had found its voice. Emergency meetings were scheduled, agendas were rewritten, and the same board members who once ignored complaints were now begging residents to attend and discuss concerns. The fear had changed sides. What started as one woman abusing power had turned into a domino effect the HOA could no longer control. At the emergency HOA meeting, one question exposed everything they'd been hiding. The community hall was packed in a way I'd never seen before, with neighbors standing along the walls and spilling into the hallway, all of them tired of being talked down to and fined into silence. The HOA board sat at the front table wearing forced smiles, acting like this was just another routine meeting. But the tension in the room made that impossible. When they opened the floor for questions, they clearly expected small complaints about parking or trash cans. What they got instead was a direct confrontation. A resident stood up and asked whether HOA representatives were allowed to enter garages and homes without permission. The board hesitated, exchanged looks, and tried to give a vague answer about community standards. That hesitation told everyone exactly what they needed to know. I followed up by calmly describing the incident, referencing the sheriff's report and the video evidence, and the room erupted. People started sharing their own experiences, yards inspected without notice, doors knocked on aggressively, threats of fines used as intimidation. The board tried to regain control, but it was too late. The illusion of authority had cracked, and now everyone could see through it. By the end of the meeting, the board was forced to promise a full review of HOA enforcement practices. While one seat at the table sat noticeably empty, the Karen who started it all, the board's full review, lasted exactly 1 week before the truth finally came out. A week later, another certified letter arrived, but this one felt different before I even opened it. Shorter, colder, and written by an actual law firm instead of the HOA's usual templates. The board had completed its review, and the conclusion was buried under layers of legal language. The HOA representative had violated policy, overstepped authority, and was no longer acting on behalf of the association. In plain terms, she had been thrown under the bus. Word spread fast, and neighbors started connecting the dots, realizing this wasn't accountability, it was damage control. The board wanted to isolate the blame to one person and move on like nothing systemic had ever happened. But the problem was, they couldn't undo the evidence, and they couldn't silence the residents anymore. A small group of homeowners formed an independent committee, demanding transparency, access to enforcement records, and a clear line between HOA rules and actual law. Attendance at meetings doubled, then tripled, and for the first time, the board had to answer questions instead of issuing fines. The power they once exercised quietly was now under constant scrutiny, and every decision they made felt heavier because people were finally watching. She thought her clipboard was a shield, but reality was about to shred it. Word got back to Karen that her actions were under official review, and suddenly the woman who strutted around the neighborhood like she was untouchable was panicking. Calls went unanswered, emails were delayed, and for the first time, her reputation was crumbling. Neighbors who once avoided confrontation now openly shared their experiences with her, posting online in community forums, sending screenshots of past intimidation, and even showing up at board meetings to speak against her behavior. Every interaction, she had become a reminder that entitlement only works as long as people tolerate it. Meanwhile, I continued documenting everything, keeping meticulous records of every incident, and quietly letting the HOA and legal advisors see the pattern. Her attempts to save face failed spectacularly. No apologies were taken seriously. No excuses were entertained. And the more she tried to defend herself, the clearer it became that she had overplayed her hand. The power she thought she had didn't vanish overnight, but it was collapsing in real time, right in front of her eyes. By the end of the week, Karen was no longer the figure of authority. She had become a cautionary tale, whispered about by neighbors and scrutinized by the very system she once thought she controlled. The moment she realized the neighborhood had turned against her, panic set in like wildfire. Karen tried to maintain a facade of control, showing up to meetings with forced confidence and rehearsed explanations. But it was obvious to everyone that the balance of power had shifted. Whispers followed her in the hallways. Neighbors exchanged knowing glances, and even casual interactions became tense. People who once ignored HOA letters or complaints now openly questioned her authority, citing specific incidents and pointing to documented evidence. Her usual tactics, threatening fines, citing bylaws, waving her clipboard like a sword, fell flat in the face of transparency. Each time she tried to justify her actions, it only made her look more reckless and isolated. Meanwhile, the independent committee formed by homeowners began circulating notices, reminding residents of their rights and outlining proper HOA procedures, essentially removing any leverage she had left. Even small gestures like walking past her house or seeing her car in the driveway triggered side glances and low murmurs. The once feared HOA Karen had become a figure of scrutiny, her power evaporating with every eyewitness account, every shared story, and every official warning filed against her. The panic was no longer hidden. It radiated from her every action, a clear signal that the neighborhood had united and her reign of unchecked authority was ending. Her next move would prove just how far entitlement can push someone and how fast it backfires. Refusing to accept the shift in power, Karen decided to take matters into her own hands, plotting what she thought would be a comeback to regain control over the neighborhood. She started showing up at residents' homes unannounced again, this time with a smug attitude, handing out notices and citing obscure HOA clauses that most people had never even heard of. But this time, the difference was glaring. People no longer cowered or complied. Cameras, smartphones, and social media were everywhere, capturing every word, every aggressive gesture, and every failed attempt to intimidate. One resident even confronted her directly, holding up the sheriff's report from the garage incident, and calmly explained that further trespassing could result in immediate arrest. Karen's confidence began cracking, her voice trembling as she tried to argue, to claim authority, and to correct what she insisted was a misunderstanding. But the neighborhood had already learned the hard truth. Rules are only as strong as the people willing to enforce them legally, and entitlement has no shield against accountability. By the time she left that street, the fear she once inspired had completely reversed, leaving her isolated, exposed, and visibly shaken. Her attempts to manipulate the HOA board were about to blow up in her face. After realizing her solo intimidation tactics were failing, Karen tried a new strategy, convincing the HOA board to back her up publicly. She scheduled private meetings, sent long emails filled with dramatic claims, and even attempted to rewrite her version of the garage incident to make herself look like the victim. But the board, now fully aware of the legal implications and the community scrutiny, refused to take her side. Every attempt she made to rally support was met with careful, measured responses from the board, reminding her that her actions were personal oversteps, not official HOA directives. Her frustration grew with every denied request, every firm email from legal counsel, and every neighbor who posted about the incident online. It was as if the walls of the authority she had clung to were crumbling, faster than she could rebuild them. Her threats, once terrifying, now carried no weight, and even her closest allies within the HOA started distancing themselves, unwilling to risk being associated with her reckless behavior. For the first time, Karen experienced what it felt like to be powerless. To watch the game she thought she controlled slip entirely out of her hands. The moment the first formal complaint was filed, everything she feared became real. A few days after her failed attempts to manipulate the board, a formal complaint landed on the HOA's desk, filed by me, with full documentation of her trespassing, aggressive behavior, and refusal to leave my property. The board could no longer pretend the garage incident was a minor mistake. Now it was a legal matter, officially recorded and supported by evidence. Karen received a copy of the complaint, and for the first time, she couldn't simply talk her way out of it or hide behind bylaws. Her emails grew frantic, her calls became desperate, and she even tried to negotiate with neighbors to drop the issue, but the neighborhood had already taken a stand. The complaint triggered a chain reaction. The HOA had to schedule a formal hearing. Legal representatives got involved, and word of the incident spread further, making it impossible for Karen to act with impunity. The carefully constructed illusion of her authority shattered, replaced by a reality where every action was scrutinized, recorded, and judged. She had gambled on entitlement, and the stakes had now turned entirely against her once the HOA hearing was announced. She realized the neighborhood wasn't just watching, everyone was waiting for her to fail. The official hearing date was set, and Karen suddenly understood she wasn't facing just one homeowner anymore. She was facing an entire community armed with evidence, witnesses, and a clear understanding of their rights. She arrived early, clutching her clipboard like it could somehow shield her from the inevitable. But the energy in the room was unmistakable. Neighbors whispered. Cameras were discreetly recording, and her usual aura of authority had vanished completely. As she tried to speak, her voice faltered under the weight of scrutiny. and every attempt to justify her actions was met with pointed questions, references to the sheriff's report, and testimonies from residents who had previously been intimidated. The HOA board, now fully aware of the legal stakes, asked precise questions that left no room for her fabricated explanations. Every false claim she made was countered with facts, video footage and witnesses. By the time the hearing ended, it was clear to everyone present. Karen's reign of unchecked HOA power had crumbled, replaced by accountability, transparency, and a neighborhood united. Her embarrassment was palpable, and even her closest allies within the HOA kept their distance, unwilling to be associated with the fallout of her reckless behavior. Facing legal scrutiny for the first time, she realized her actions had real consequences. After the hearing, the HOA board and legal counsel made it clear that Karen's unauthorized entry wasn't just a misunderstanding, it was a formal trespassing violation. Letters were sent, warnings documented, and the threat of potential fines or even criminal charges hung over her like a storm cloud. For someone used to wielding authority with impunity, this was entirely new territory. She attempted to downplay it to neighbors, claiming she had done nothing wrong, but no one believed her anymore. Every interaction, every recorded incident, every eyewitness account stacked against her. Even casual conversations on the street or in the local cafe became reminders of her failed attempts at intimidation. Karen had spent years thinking that her clipboard and her knowledge of bylaws were enough to control the neighborhood, but now she was forced to navigate lawyers, formal complaints, and a community that no longer feared her. The reality was undeniable. Entitlement has limits, and crossing legal boundaries, even under the guise of authority, can bring the world crashing down fast. The moment neighbors realized they could challenge her, the entire dynamic of the community shifted forever. Karen had always relied on fear and confusion to maintain control, but now the neighborhood had discovered a powerful weapon: knowledge. People started documenting every interaction, recording videos of any unsolicited visits, and sharing information about their rights under property law. The once feared HOA, Karen tried to respond with threats and passive-aggressive letters, but nobody flinched anymore. Parents, retirees, and long-time residents began openly questioning her authority at meetings, in group chats, and even during casual encounters on the street. Every attempt she made to reclaim dominance was met with pushback, evidence and witnesses ready to speak up. What had been a solo act of intimidation turned into a community-wide movement, where residents were no longer passive, they were empowered. Karen's presence became a reminder of her failures, her threats lost potency, and the aura of control she once commanded had completely evaporated. For the first time, she wasn't the enforcer, she was the one being scrutinized. When her own neighbors started recording her, she finally understood she had no escape. Karen, desperate to regain control, returned to a few houses unannounced, hoping her old tactics would intimidate residents into compliance. But this time, smartphones were out, cameras were rolling, and the moment she crossed property lines, neighbors confronted her with proof of prior incidents. Her usual smirk faltered. Voice shook, and every word she tried to use as a threat was met with calm reminders of trespassing, laws, and her documented misconduct. The community wasn't just watching anymore, they were actively holding her accountable. Even the HOA board could no longer shield her, as the documentation she had amassed against herself was too extensive to ignore. Her reputation, carefully built over years of enforcing petty rules, was in ruins, and whispers turned into bold statements of resistance. People she had once intimidated now spoke freely, challenging every claim, citing laws, and refusing to comply with arbitrary demands. Karen realized too late that entitlement and authority aren't the same, and once the neighborhood turned, there was no going back. The final confrontation was inevitable, and it was worse than anyone expected. Karen, emboldened by arrogance but unaware of the mounting legal and social pressure, attempted one last power move. showing up at my property with a new batch of notices, claiming she had urgent HOA business that required immediate access. I refused, calmly explaining that any further entry without permission would be treated as trespassing, and that law enforcement had already been involved. She argued, shouted, and even tried to manipulate the wording of her notices to intimidate me, but every word was met with firm resistance and the knowledge that the sheriff's report and video evidence were on file. Her frustration grew visibly, her face flushed with panic, and bystanders, neighbors who had witnessed her previous antics, gathered and began recording again. The pattern of her behavior was now fully exposed, and her attempts to reclaim authority collapsed in real time. Eventually, she left, muttering threats that no one took seriously. Her aura of dominance shattered. The neighborhood had united, the law was on our side, and Karen's final attempt at control had turned into the ultimate public humiliation, cementing her downfall once and for all. With Karen finally out of the way, the neighborhood realized just how much power they truly had. The days after her final confrontation were surreal. Instead of fear, there was relief, and instead of whispered complaints, neighbors openly shared their experiences and strategies for holding the HOA accountable. Community meetings became collaborative, transparent and productive, with residents setting clear boundaries and establishing protocols for any future inspections or visits. Karen's reign of intimidation was over, and the board had no choice but to enforce new rules to prevent anyone from abusing authority again. People who once felt powerless now had confidence, cameras, records, and legal awareness on their side. Even casual strolls down the street felt different. The aura of control had shifted from one individual to a community united by vigilance and mutual respect. Her legacy wasn't fear, it was a cautionary tale, a reminder that entitlement cannot override law, and that a united neighborhood can challenge even the most audacious abuses of power. The HOA had survived, but it would never be the same, and the residents finally understood that accountability wasn't just a word, it was a movement. Even weeks later, the ripples of her actions were still shaking the HOA to its core. After Karen's final humiliation, the neighborhood didn't just go back to normal, it reorganized. Homeowners who had once avoided meetings now attended regularly, asking pointed questions, reviewing bylaws, and demanding transparency. The HOA board, chastened by the public and legal scrutiny, implemented strict policies for inspections, documentation, and resident notifications to ensure no representative could ever act unilaterally again. Karen tried to maintain a presence through emails and phone calls, but the community had grown vigilant. Every communication she sent was scrutinized, logged, and often ignored. Neighbors shared updates in group chats, confirming that accountability was no longer optional, it was mandatory. Even minor incidents were addressed collectively, ensuring no single person could dominate or intimidate anyone. Her influence, once feared, had vanished entirely, leaving a neighborhood that was stronger, more united and more empowered than ever. It was clear Karen's actions had backfired spectacularly, creating a community that wouldn't allow such chaos again. Her personal reputation took hits no fines or bylaws could ever fix. Even outside HOA meetings, Karen felt the consequences of her reckless behavior. Word of her trespassing and public humiliation spread quickly, not just among neighbors, but also online community forums where residents discussed property rights, HOA accountability, and documented incidents. Her credibility evaporated. People no longer trusted her judgment, her authority, or even her presence in the neighborhood. Former allies avoided her, wary of being associated with someone whose actions had caused legal scrutiny and public embarrassment. Social interactions became tense, awkward, and isolating. Neighbors whispered, watched, and recorded. Her attempts to explain or justify her actions were met with disbelief, and any future claims of authority were immediately challenged. Slowly, she became a cautionary tale rather than a figure of influence, proving that abusing perceived power can destroy not only control but personal reputation. The neighborhood, in contrast, had grown stronger, more united, and more confident in asserting their rights, ensuring that no one like her could ever dominate them. Again, the HOA finally learned that rules mean nothing without accountability, and the neighborhood enforced it. With Karen sidelined and legal oversight firmly in place, the HOA board took unprecedented steps to rebuild trust. Policies were rewritten to clarify exactly what representatives could and could not do, and every resident was given access to clear procedures for inspections, complaints, and violations. The neighborhood, now emboldened, actively monitored compliance, shared information, and held meetings to ensure transparency. Even small incidents were addressed openly, with documentation and witness testimony, making it impossible for anyone to exploit ambiguity for personal power. Karen's previous intimidation tactics were now studied as a warning example, and any attempt by her or anyone like her to exert unchecked authority would immediately be challenged. What had begun as a single act of trespass had transformed into a lasting lesson. The community's unity, vigilance, and knowledge of their rights could overcome even the boldest abuse of HOA power. The final chapter wasn't about revenge, it was about reclaiming control. Months after the incident, the neighborhood had fully transformed. Residents who once feared fines, inspections, or arbitrary rules now felt empowered to participate in every HOA decision, attend meetings, and monitor compliance. Karen had become a non-factor. Her name evoked eye rolls and whispered reminders of what happens when entitlement meets accountability. The HOA board, chastened and wary of legal exposure, enforced strict boundaries and procedures, ensuring that no one could ever trespass or intimidate residents again. Community trust had been restored, strengthened by collective action, transparency, and vigilance. What began as a single garage intrusion had evolved into a neighborhood-wide awakening, proving that unity, documentation, and knowledge of rights could overturn even the most audacious abuse of power. The streets were calmer, the residents confident, and Karen's reign of fear was nothing more than a cautionary tale etched into neighborhood history. And in the end, the neighborhood emerged stronger, wiser, and unbreakable. Karen's actions may have started a storm, but they inadvertently forged a community that refused to be intimidated. Residents now knew their rights, kept records of interactions, and supported one another against overreach, ensuring no single person could ever wield unchecked power again. HOA meetings became transparent, collaborative, and fair, with active participation from homeowners who had once remained silent. Karen faded into the background, her authority gone, her reputation damaged beyond repair, and her attempts at intimidation remembered only as lessons. The story of that garage, that trespassing incident, and the ensuing showdown became legendary, a reminder that unity, vigilance, and accountability are stronger than fear, fines, or clipboards. The neighborhood had reclaimed control, rewritten the rules, and proven that entitlement has limits, and when crossed, justice, community-driven or legal, is inevitable. In the end, what started as a confrontation became a victory for every resident, a permanent shift in power, and a lasting testament to what happens when people refuse to be silenced.